Welcome to the Shepherd's Pie, a slice of hope to raise faithful kids, where we focus on topics that impact young people today. I'm Antony Barone Kolenk. I'm a father of 5 who served in the Air Force for 21 years. I'm now a law professor and a columnist for Practical Homeschooling magazine. I'm also the author of The Harwood Mysteries, an inspirational medieval fiction series for kids aged 10 and up. Here on the Shepherd's Pie, we want to inform, inspire, and help you to raise happy, healthy, faithful kids, whether you're a grandparent, a pastor, a teacher, anyone. In today's episode, I speak with Julie Ash, a Benedictine Oblate of Clear Creek Abbey in Oklahoma, and the author of a young adult novel dealing with religious vocations. We talk about the importance of vocations for youth and discuss some tips on how to present the idea of vocations to them at a young age. In the entertainment segment of the show, Jen and Kate Waldyke from Catholic Mom and Daughter talk to us about the book Miraculous: Catholic Mysteries for Kids by Catherine Swigert. We hear a lot today about the crisis in Catholic vocations in the United States and throughout the world. There have been a lot of news stories over the years about priest shortages in major cities in the United States, including Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York. I know it seems in the past number of years we've had some great candidates as seminarians, as nuns, and other religious vocations, and that those young people who are responding to God's call are a true inspiration and seem to be truly dedicating their lives to God's work. What will it take to increase Catholic vocations? How do we expose young people to the idea of vocations, especially teenage girls who don't have the opportunity to become priests and who often hear in the media negative things about the Catholic Church, its treatment of women? What's the right age to start talking to kids about vocations? I've known several young people who have thought about a vocation when they were younger, but then gave it up in their teenage years or young adulthood. And I've met many others who didn't realize they had a vocation until they were a little bit older in life. My guest today is Julie Ash. She herself pondered throughout her life whether she had a vocation, and she discusses her own journey and how she has come to believe that we need to present vocations information to young people at an earlier age. And she's even written a novel to try to accomplish that. Today I have with me Julie Ash. She is a Benedictine Oblate of Clear Creek Abbey in Oklahoma. She's also an author of teen fiction, a former legal assistant, and a single mom of a disabled son. Her young adult novel is called In the Palace of the Great King, and it presents the truth of the faith, and it also promotes religious vocations. She's been a copy editor for the Institute for Excellence in Writing, which is a writing curriculum publishing company, and her novel was released in September of 2021. Julie, welcome to the show.
Hi, Tony. Thanks for having me.
So we are going to be talking about several things today. We definitely want to talk about your novel, In the Palace of the Great King. But even before we get to that, I was interested a little bit in what it means to be an oblate at a Benedictine Abbey. You know, my Harwood Mysteries series takes place at a Benedictine Abbey in the Middle Ages. So I'm wondering, what is an oblate?
An oblate is the Benedictine counterpart of a third order for the laity. But with the Benedictines, you actually are affiliated with a particular congregation and a particular monastery or abbey in this case. So what that means is that it's sort of living out one of the Benedictine charisms, which is stability. And the whole concept being that you're supposed to stay with that abbey for the rest of your life. As an oblate, you go through a novitiate of 1 year. You make promises after that time if you choose to do so. And then you're part of that abbey for the rest of your life. It's a wonderful blessing. I've received much more from that than I have given of myself. I made my final promise in 2017. We renew our promises annually.
And are the promises that you make as a layperson the same vows that a Benedictine monk or nun would make, or how are they different?
I think they're pretty much the same. We make promises of stability, conversion of life, and obedience. It's different than the normal promises or vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. It's more geared toward a conversion of life, conversatio, and of course, following the rule of Saint Benedict. But I guess from their perspective, like for example, chastity, that just comes more or less under obedience, chastity according to your state in life.
It's nice to hear you say stability, conversion, and obedience, because those are the same vows in the 12th century that my monks talk about with my main character, Zan, in the Harwood Mysteries. So it doesn't sound like they've changed much in the last 1,000 years. So you've written this book in the Palace of the Great King, and maybe you could set up for us a little bit of the premise. What is the book about?
It's the story of how two teenage girls from very different backgrounds hear the call to religious life and conversion and act on that, and how their lives intertwine. But it's about so much more than that. It's about the values that the church teaches, as opposed to the values that most of the values of our society today are in total opposition.
So I see the way that the book seems to be advertising, the two characters, Shar and Kayla, are two spoiled upper class girls. So these are the girls who get the call to a vocation.
That was the other challenge, is I was trying to show the various vocations. Originally, when I started out, I was going to have Tia Esperanza experience a religious vocation to contemplative life. And I was going to have Shar Fisher receive a call to the single life as a single person. Because at that time, I didn't, when I started writing this book, it was like 20 years ago. I had heard about the vocation to the single life. And then her sister Kayla was going to be called to the married state. But in the course of my own discernment process, I learned a lot of things. Personally went through a lot of changes from being a more kind of mainstream conservative Catholic to a more traditional Catholic. What I've learned is that traditionally, the concept of vocation, marriage was the standard vocation for everybody. Everybody was called to the married state. But that what a religious vocation or a vocation to the priesthood was really a calling out of that, the standard vocation to marriage. So I ended up making a lot of changes to this book as it went along. And it was really a kind of a growth process for me as well. And it reflected the changes that I personally was going through.
I can sympathize with you on this because it took me about 20 years to get Shadow in the Dark in its final form. And that too, that was the first book in my trilogy there. That too went through several different iterations that kind of changed along the way. So I know how tough it is when you've had a book that's evolved like that. So in your final form of this book, you've got Shar, Kayla, and Tia Esperanza. But what are the vocations they're called to as the story unfolds now?
I don't want to give away too much of that because that's sort of a surprise.
Ah, okay.
I mean, Kayla is very much called to married state from the beginning, and that's pretty clear. But how the other vocations play out is a little more complicated. So I won't say too much about that.
Sure. So what about the title, In the Palace of the Great King? What was your inspiration for that title?
Saint Teresa of Avila, I always wanted to be a Carmelite. So I was very influenced by her own vocational journey and her writings. The very last page in my book is a quotation from Saint Teresa called A Palace of Priceless Worth from the Way of Perfection. And she talks about the soul as being a palace. But concurrently, I have been very impacted by church architecture and the beauty of churches and cathedrals, especially that were built in previous decades, previous centuries. So I have my characters experience that also. there's sort of a two meanings to that. The palace that we construct for our Lord and for the church in the physical world, and then the palace of our souls in the spiritual world.
That's wonderful. All right, so let's bring this back to youth then. You've targeted this book at a young audience. What is it about the situation of teenage girls today that needs this kind of a novel for them to help appreciate the importance of vocation?
Well, I think teenagers today are pretty much like teenagers in all times. But what has changed is the milieu that they're growing up in, the environment that they're growing up in. It's like everything is out there, everything is on the table right now. If you go to any mainstream store, if and you search for books for teenage girls, I would say a good 20% of them are about witchcraft, having same-sex relationships, etc. So my thought was, I wanted to present the Catholic perspective, but to do it in a way that's entertaining, because the choices that teenagers make will affect them for the rest of their lives. And so if they don't hear about these things when they're young, it's kind of hard to go back when you're 25 or 30 and you've set out on a certain direction in your life. It's really important that teen girls get exposed to these ideas. Yes, you can dedicate your life to God. You can choose to live in total purity, to make that sacrificial self gift for the church and for Christ. It's so much easier for a young person to adapt themselves to a more ascetical life. And also there's lots of hard work that takes place in a monastery. It is more difficult when you get older to do that kind of work.
So going back to kind of your main audience, I mean, I guess I'm one of these people that thinks God will take us where we need to go. And I'm wondering about teenage girls today. You're saying they're exposed to so much, they don't even hear about this. Is it your thought that there are a lot of girls who might have a vocation and just never realize that because they never are open to the calling?
Yes. I mean, in my case, I grew up in a non-practicing Protestant home. So I didn't really have any experience of church at all. But it wasn't until I actually saw The Sound of Music when I was 6 years old, and I saw nuns for the first time. I was like, oh, who are those women and what are they doing? It's like you have to have it presented to you before you can respond to it. So my hope is that this book will find itself into the right hands of the young ladies who need to read it, and that it will be for them that little light that goes off and say, oh yes, I would like to try that.
Right. So as they're reading the novel, they see sort of the journey these girls are on, and it's going to open their eyes to some pathways they might not have even appreciated. And in fact, I mean, it seems to me that what's presented in the media about religious life today is almost overwhelmingly negative. And contrast that with maybe back in the 1940s or 50s, where maybe the movies were really trying to present all these positive things. But I think we've got the opposite going now. Have you observed that? Is that part of why you have this book out?
From my perspective, I don't see anything positive in the media about religious life, except for I have seen some media reports about certain active communities that are doing work, like social justice type work. But particularly just regard with contemplative life, I think it's just it's hidden away. Nobody really knows it's even there. That's what I was really trying to bring out, was just to let people know that it's there, to let girls know that it's there, and that it's okay to be countercultural. It's okay to sort of rebel against society or even against your parents if that's what it takes, to look for the things that are really important in life and not just the superficial things. And also, just when I was growing up and I was very much feeling called to religious life, there was just nothing out there that appealed to me that I wanted to read. And so I would hope that for girls that already do hear that call and do want to follow that path, that it's just something entertaining for them that they can read and enjoy.
Let's talk a few minutes about parents and youth leaders and people who interact with kids, teachers. First of all, how can we as adults working with youth identify somebody who might have a calling to a vocation? Are there any signs that we can see in a teenager growing up?
God calls all different types of people. What they talk about, Saint Teresa talks about in her biography about how she used to love to go to dances, and she wanted to go off and be a martyr. Saint Therese wanted to be a missionary to other lands, and they ended up doing completely different things. So I think you have to present it to everyone and let the person respond, however God is leading them. I don't think you can necessarily, look at a person and say, oh, they have a vocation. I mean, probably religious sisters can do that, say, oh, I'll bet she's got a vocation. But I don't think we should limit it to people just based on what we think. I think it should be presented to everybody.
Now, you mentioned that you yourself might have felt a calling to religious life throughout your life. And although you haven't told me your whole story here yet, I did hear you say 2017 was when you took your vows. So it strikes me that that calling wasn't fulfilled until later in your life.
Yes, my situation, I think, sort of is shared by a lot of women my age, grew up in the 60s and 70s. There was a lot of turmoil going on in the church at that time. A lot of changes were taking place in religious communities, just a lot of social upheaval in general. For whatever reason, there were a lot of young women my age who missed their vocation, quote unquote. But God can work around that. I never particularly wanted to become a Benedictine, but that's how it ended up. And that's sort of the lesson of vocation, I think, especially in these times when there's so many changes and so much division in the church, that if you give your life to God, He will do things, He will use you, He will accept your self gift, but it may go in a completely different direction than you yourself had thought. But the best way from my perspective is that young people get the message about religious vocations when they're young, and nobody really talks in the church that I hear very much, and definitely not in society, about purity, chastity, and virginity. Nobody talks about that. I think that's another message that we definitely need to be talking to young people about, and why you really need to guard your children against what they have access to on the internet. Because once you cross that line and you see certain things, it's there forever in your head. It makes it very difficult for young people to sort of focus on a religious vocation when they've got all these other images and messages going on around them all the time. So
Yeah, and I think your journey, I was referencing earlier this idea that, if we're open to God, I think he brings us to where ultimately we need to go, and it may be by different routes than we thought. And you mentioned Saint Teresa and Saint Therese as other examples of people who thought they were going to take a certain route and wound up in a different place. I think that is a powerful message to know it's never too late.
well, I don't know. I have a more sort of hardline attitude about it. I guess it can be too late, and I discovered that myself. I mean, I'm not saying that that's true for everyone. Again, that's why it's very important that we talk to our young people, and it's very possible to receive a call to religious life at a very young age. I was kind of hoping to reach a lot of unchurched children or youth with my book, because unless you do grow up in a church going family, it's very, very hard to hear that message and to even know what's out there.
Turning this back to parents then as we kind of wrap things up, do you have any advice to them on how they should talk to their teens, especially teenage girls, about vocation and religious life in a way that would be productive and might help them to be open to God's will?
I would say sometimes teenagers are open to conversations like that, but I think a lot of times they sort of keep that sort of thing to themselves. They may not feel comfortable sharing about that, but having the materials available in the home for them anything having to do with vocation that's available for them to look at and to read themselves. I know the Council of Major Superiors of Women Religious puts out like a booklet every year that has a little blurb on all of their various communities in their group, just to subscribe to these kind of things so that it's there in the home. And then at that point you can say, oh, does anything in here appeal to you? The prayer life in the home, of course, is the most important. Just to pray that rosary every day and make that a priority, the spiritual health of the family, and then everything else will fall into place.
Wonderful. And if parents wanted to get a hold, or teens wanted to get a hold of your book, In the Palace of the Great King, where would you like them to go to get a copy?
You can find the book on Amazon, or you can just go to my website, which is julieash.com. You can get the Kindle version, which is shareable, so you can share it with all your other friends or family.
Well, Julie, thank you so much for being on the show and sharing your experiences and your thoughts on vocation. This is an important topic.
Thank you, Tony. I enjoyed it.
In our entertainment review segment today, we have back with us Catholic mom and daughter, Jen and Kate Waldyke, who run a YouTube channel where they review books, curriculums, and talk about all matters of the faith. They are my go-to book reviewers. Jen and Kate, welcome back to the show.
Right. Yeah, it's good to be back.
It's always great to be on your show. We love to talk about books.
Maybe a little too much.
One of our very favorite things.
Absolutely. So what have you brought me today?
Today we have the book Miraculous Catholic Mysteries for Kids by Catherine Griffin Swigert.
Tell us a little bit about the book.
This book has 10 different stories about the mysteries of the Catholic faith, including some of our very favorite ones about John Bosco and his mysterious guardian dog that he had for 30 years. I mean, there is no dog that lives for 30 years.
Stories like the Shroud of Turin, all the mysterious stuff going on there.
Well, I don't. You probably don't know this about me, but I went to a Salesian high school, Don Bosco High School in New Jersey. That was my exposure to St. John Bosco. We definitely had a devotion to him, and he had some amazing things going on in his life. Although I don't remember learning a lot about this dog. What's the deal about the dog?
Okay, so he was on the streets of Turin rounding up all the boys who didn't have homes or who were in gangs, and a lot of people wanted to stop him. So he needed to be protected. When he would go out on the street at night, this big, huge dog would just appear out of nowhere. And while the dog was with him, no one would hurt him. So this dog continued to appear as needed for over 30 years. And his name was Grigio.
All right. So that's one of the great stories in there. And what age range would you say the book is good for?
All right. If you have older elementary kids who are fairly good readers, they could definitely read this on their own because the chapters are short and it's written in a really conversational style, easy to read. But for your little ones, they would absolutely love this if you read it out loud.
It would be a perfect book to read out loud.
Because it's very exciting and it has nice illustrations in it too.
Kate, what did you like about the illustrations? Did they grab your attention?
They're very clean style illustrations, but they're very beautiful. I think it sums up the story very nicely.
Yeah, the pictures just give you a hint of what's coming and you think, oh, what's that? What is he doing?
It gets you intrigued.
So we've got, you said 10 stories. You mentioned the Shroud of Turin and John Bosco. So lots of Italian stuff going on. What else do we have in there?
We have the Miraculous Staircase of Loreto with St. Joseph. There's also the Miracle of the Sun from Fatima, Juan Diego's Tilma, and a very recent saint, Carlos Acutis, is in here.
Oh, wonderful.
So that's nice. Yeah. And then in the very back, there is a section called Science Explains Faith. So if you have a kid who is really, maybe like wondering like, oh, this could be made up, or I'm not sure about all this. This gives them more information about the science behind these mysteries.
Very fascinating to read.
Yeah, I was going to say, Kate, for an older teen, it sounds like that might be geared more for younger kids. Did you find it still to be a good read? And if so, why?
Yeah, it was still very interesting. Even being older, it's still enjoyable. It gives you a look at the stories from our faith, what we know and love, and some of the ones that we might not have heard of. So it really lets you explore the Catholic faith.
Wonderful. And tell me a little bit about the author. You said, is this a religious?
I believe that Catherine Swigert is a religious sister. I'm not sure. We found her books on Amazon. There is another one in the series about Eucharistic miracles. So I think that this one, Miraculous, along with the Eucharistic miracles, I've given those as a set as a first communion gift before. You can get both books for under $20 on Amazon. So that's a really fun, kind of economical first communion gift to give someone.
Wonderful. Is there a name to that series, or is it just a similar style?
I believe the series is called Catholic Mysteries for Kids.
All right. So the title of this one is Miraculous by
Catherine Griffin Swigert, Swegart. Swigert.
Wonderful. Great. And you can find that on Amazon, I guess, is where you are, where you're saying you found it.
Yes.
So thank you for bringing that to our attention today. And we will definitely have to check that out as we look at some of the different miracles for our kids to learn about. Thank you.
You're welcome. It's always a pleasure to be on your show. Bye-bye.
That's all the time we have for the show today. We spoke with Benedictine Julie Ash about the importance of youth vocations, and Catholic mom and daughter Jen and Kate Waldyke reviewed Catherine Swigert's young adult book, Miraculous: Catholic Mysteries for Kids. Again, this is Anthony Barone Kolank, and this has been The Shepherd's Pie. If any of you listening today have a question for me or a topic you'd like to have us cover on the show, please drop me a line on my website at antonykolenk.com. That's ANTONYKOLENC.com. Also, if you visit my website, you can learn more about my historical fiction series for kids, The Harwood Mysteries. I'll end as always with my wife's favorite scripture quote from Romans 8:28. We know that all things work for good for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. May the Lord bless and keep you this week.